young people during this time period that you grew up in were quite active. There was a lot of opposition to the Vietnam War, especially on college campuses. It was sort of a hotbed for counterculture, rejection of establishment. So as a young person on campus during all these sort of protests in the Vietnam War, you were there. You had a firsthand seat to watch this. So what was that experience like? What was your kind of thoughts on the counterculture revolution?
Yeah, very, very mixed. Um, so I was the guy on campus when there were demonstrations, and actually by the time the fall of 1972 came around, there were not the number of college demonstrations that there had been in from let's say 67 to 1970 or 71.
Right.
Um, but I was the odd duck out because I I was going to work mostly. I mean, I went to school full time and I worked virtually full time. I was the one going to the Nixon White House, so
Yeah,
I didn't participate in those things.
for sure.
Um, but that it was a very stressful time. Uh, I sat with a friend who was older who watched on television to see if his draft number came up in the lottery, and it did. And so there was no one that I knew who was anxious to go. The other thing was that it was a kind of a shock to us, maybe less for my parents' generation and even my grandparents because of the two world wars. But we hadn't been even touched remotely by death in war, most of us, as kids, 12, 13 years old. And I can remember very well in high school when the principal would come to the door of the class, happened a couple of times, and they'd pull one of the students out, and his parents would be out there, and they'd let them know that their brother had died in Vietnam. And it was it was a tense time, but it was not. While it was openly discussed, you wouldn't find a lot of people who would necessarily disagree with the fact that we shouldn't be there or
Yeah,
that we shouldn't have been there.
for sure. Yeah.
And that is something else that I can recommend that is to read about Robert McNamara, who is the Secretary of Defense, and read about Johnson, President Johnson in those days. I have a piece that's in the book that's about Vietnam. It talks about the Gulf of Tonkin and and several of the things that we allowed to have happen or purposely misread in order to escalate the war.
Yeah.
And that began a problem that became known as the credibility gap,
Yeah.
where people started to not to believe the government, that and the fact that you could see it at night on Walter Cronkite and actually see war was a very different experience than listening to my dad talk about the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah, that's a great point. And my last episode we talked about the Vietnam War, and one of the interesting things we talked about is that the Vietnam War was the first television war. In World War II, you had these sort of government-sponsored newsreels. You're just reading kind of what the government approves in the media, very pro-patriotic, buy our war bonds, support the war effort, um, sort of really propaganda. But in Vietnam, you have news journalists with television cameras who are there, and you're seeing the death and the bloodshed. And also, it's sort of an unpopular war. We're not achieving our objectives as fast as the American people would like. We're seeing sustained brutality over long periods of time without any sort of real tangible gain or benefit. And it really drove a lot of people away and created, like you said, that credibility gap, which,
Yeah, I happened to. I had left employment at the White House, but I happened to be there visiting some friends on the day that uh, that we left Saigon,
Oh wow.
and to see the looks on the faces of my friends who they had only touched it remotely in most cases. It was a horrible thing for everyone. The fact that we lost um, paled in comparison to what was happening to the people in Saigon at the
Hmm.
time. But we didn't leave them behind, and and did our best to get them out. But that was a huge shock to the system for the country. Although it was welcome.
Yeah, this is basically what we talked about last episode, the conclusion of the Vietnam War. Um, Sort of the epitome of Kissinger's realpolitik, um, making making choosing the less bad option, basically, um, and the decision to get out of Vietnam. I mean, the American public was so tired of it. My last guest, Keith Saliba, he's basically saying by the end of the Vietnam War, the policies were working, but everyone was so tired of the war, and Nixon had promised that we were going to get out of the war, that Nixon didn't really care. All he cared about was finishing the war, by whatever means necessary. And between him and Kissinger, their talks were, as long as Saigon doesn't fall right after our withdrawal, they can sleep at night. So if they fall a month later, it's pretty bad. But if they fall, and I believe Saigon fell after the Paris Peace Accords, I believe it fell like 2 years later. So
It was very fast. It did not take a long time.
yeah, it's a shame. But I mean, going back to the young people and you're being the oddball out. I mean, that was especially true because you worked for Nixon. Um, most young people at that time were pretty anti-Nixon, and you were working for him. So did you ever run into people, maybe some girls, and you're talking to these girls, having a good time, and then you're like, oh, yeah, I work at the White House or whatever, and they're just like, oh, and you see that attitude shift.
It happens all the time. Mentioning that you worked for Nixon could get you a brick in the back of the head. Um, no, I became pretty unpopular in a lot of corners pretty quickly, but that was okay. I mean, and as it turned into Watergate, then just that got work. How could you work for a crook like that, and all of those kinds of things? And the answer is, he was the president. I had no policy role. Okay, I delivered mail and
Right.
other things, and so it, but nevertheless, that it may have been my just too much of my charming personality for them, and they couldn't stand it.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. They realized that you were out of their league, so they had
Yeah,
to
right.
they
Yeah,
had to cope
actually,
with.
I had the worst time. I ended up, because of volunteer work I had done, I ended up with tickets, a friend of mine and I, to the inaugural youth balls. And it was hell to try to get a date. It finally happened that I got a date because I ran into a girl physically uh, in the campus hub,
Yeah,
and she agreed to go. But most people rejected me pretty quickly.
that's funny. Yeah, you sort of have to change your approach, uh, and omit those damning details when you're talking to the ladies.